Anthony Carter watched the store's security footage for the third time, his jaw tightening with frustration. Customer complaints had risen sharply at one of his 9 stores, and employee turnover was alarmingly high. He had spent years building this business after buying it from its previous owner, turning it into a successful chain, but lately, something felt off. No matter how many reports he read or meetings he held, he couldn't get a clear answer. So, he decided to see it for himself. Anthony had never personally met most of the employees at this particular store. With 9 locations and a corporate team handling hiring, it was impossible to know everyone. He would blend in easily. With a slight change to his hair, glasses, and a name tag that read Tony, he applied as a temporary stock associate. When he arrived for his first shift, the store was chaotic. The shelves were half empty, employees rushed around with tense expressions, and customers seemed frustrated. A young worker, maybe 19 or 20, was carefully stacking boxes near the front, his movements precise and efficient. "Hey, I'm Tony. New here," Anthony introduced himself. The young man wiped his hands on his apron and smiled. "Nice to meet you, Tony. I'm Ryan. It's a rough day, but it's always like this." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Always." Ryan nodded, lowering his voice. "We're short-staffed because people keep quitting, and well, you'll see why." Before Anthony could ask more, a frail, elderly woman struggled to lift a heavy bag of pet food onto her cart. Ryan immediately rushed over. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he said kindly, lifting the bag with ease and placing it in her cart. The woman beamed. "Oh, thank you, young man, that's very sweet of you." But before she could roll away, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Ryan, what do you think you're doing?" A tall man in a manager's vest stormed over, his face red with irritation. "Helping a customer," Ryan said, clearly confused by the anger. The manager scoffed. "That's not your job. You're here to stock shelves, not waste time playing customer service hero. If they need help, they can ask at the front." The elderly woman frowned. "He was just being polite. I appreciate his help." The manager ignored her, turning his glare back to Ryan. "You do that again, and I'm cutting your hours. Get back to work." Anthony clenched his fists. He had expected to see some issues, but this, humiliating an employee for showing kindness. He had to bite his tongue to keep from revealing himself right then and there. Instead, he watched as Ryan swallowed his frustration and returned to work without protest. Anthony knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Anthony spent the rest of his shift watching closely. He wasn't just here to observe, he needed to understand the full extent of the problems. The manager, whose name tag read Derek, seemed to rule the store through intimidation. Employees barely spoke to one another unless necessary, moving quickly as if afraid to be caught standing still. By midday, Anthony had already seen enough to know why turnover was high. The atmosphere was tense, every interaction between Derek and the staff laced with impatience or outright hostility. When an employee asked for clarification on a task, Derek barely looked up before snapping a dismissive response. If someone made a mistake, he didn't correct them, he berated them. At one point, Anthony spotted a woman working the register, her movement stiff. A customer asked her a question about a discount, and before she could finish explaining, Derek appeared next to her, cutting her off loudly. The customer looked uncomfortable as Derek spoke over the cashier, correcting her in a condescending tone. Anthony turned to Ryan, who was stocking a nearby shelf. "Does he always do that?" he asked quietly. Ryan didn't look up from his work. "Yeah, if someone messes up, he makes sure everyone knows about it. Nobody wants to ask questions because it just makes things worse." Anthony absorbed that. Leadership wasn't about control, it was about support. A good manager guided their team, not belittled them. Derek seemed to have no interest in developing his staff, only in asserting dominance. When the lunch break rolled around, employees scattered quickly, some heading out, others eating in the small break room. Ryan sat at a table in the corner, unwrapping a sandwich. Anthony sat across from him. "You're good at your job," Anthony said. "I saw how fast you work." Ryan gave a small shrug. "I try, but it doesn't really matter. People like me don't last long here." Anthony frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Derek doesn't like employees who make him look bad. If you work too hard, if customers notice you, he finds a reason to get rid of you." That explained a lot. Ryan wasn't the problem. Derek was deliberately keeping strong employees from staying too long. Anthony leaned back, thinking. He needed to see Derek in action for himself, needed to push him just enough to reveal more of his true nature. Later that afternoon, Anthony deliberately slowed his pace while stocking shelves, waiting for Derek to notice. It didn't take long. Derek walked by, then stopped abruptly. "Tony, what are you doing?" "Stocking the shelves," Anthony said evenly. "Yeah, at a snail's pace. You think this is a joke?" Anthony shook his head. "No, just trying to make sure everything's organized properly." Derek scoffed. "This isn't rocket science, just get it done." Anthony met his gaze. "I saw Ryan helping a customer earlier, and you got mad, but isn't good service important?" Derek's eyes narrowed. "You sound like one of those corporate types. Customers are not my problem. My job is to keep this place running, not babysit. If people want extra help, they can go to a store that has time for that." Anthony let that statement sit for a moment. Derek had no idea who he was talking to. But the moment that sealed Derek's fate came at the end of the shift. Ryan was about to clock out when a woman in her late 20s approached him with a nervous expression. "Excuse me," she said. "I was here last week, and I think I left my wallet at the register. I called, and someone said they'd check for it, but I never heard back." Ryan glanced toward the front desk, then at Derek, who was across the room. "I can check for you." Before he could take a step, Derek's voice rang out. "Ryan, clock out, now." Ryan hesitated. "She just needs help finding." "I don't care," Derek snapped. "You're off the clock. If she lost something, she should have kept track of it. We don't have time for this." The woman looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Ryan ignored Derek and walked toward the front desk. He checked a drawer behind the counter and pulled out a small black wallet. "Is this yours?" The woman's face lit up. "Yes, thank you so much." Derek's face darkened. "Ryan, you're done here. Hand in your apron. You're fired." Anthony took a step forward, his patience snapping. He had seen enough. "Derek," he said, his voice firm, "that's not happening." Derek turned to him, eyes flashing. "And who do you think you are?" Anthony pulled off his glasses and straightened his posture. "I'm Anthony Carter. I own this company." The room went silent. Employees who had been within earshot stopped what they were doing. Derek's face drained of color. Anthony crossed his arms. "And think we need to have a serious conversation about how you run this store." The store had fallen into a stunned silence. Employees who had been moving about their tasks now stood frozen, their eyes darting between Anthony and Derek. Customers lingered near the registers, sensing something significant was unfolding, but unsure of the details. Derek's face twitched as he struggled to regain control of the situation. His usual air of authority faltered now that he realized who stood before him. The color in his face shifted from pale shock to a deep, blotchy red. Anthony held Derek's gaze for a long moment, letting the weight of the reveal settle in. "You own," Derek started, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing a laugh that came out forced and unnatural. "Look, this is just a misunderstanding." Anthony didn't blink. "No, it's not. I've been here all day. I've watched how you treat employees, how you dismiss customers, and how you foster an environment where people are afraid to speak up." Derek's eyes darted around, looking for support, but the employees remained silent, their expressions unreadable. He squared his shoulders, attempting to reclaim authority. "I run this store efficiently," Derek said, his voice firmer now. "You don't understand what it takes to manage a team on the ground. You own the company, but you're not in the day-to-day. These employees need structure. If I don't keep them in line, nothing gets done." Anthony's jaw tightened. Keeping them in line? That's not leadership, that's control, and it's exactly why this store has a turnover problem. He motioned toward Ryan, who still stood near the register, his apron clutched in his hands. "You just fired an employee for helping a customer. I watched you humiliate another worker earlier for something just as ridiculous. This isn't about efficiency, it's about power." Derek's nostrils flared. "I do what I have to do to keep things running. If you start letting employees do whatever they want, you'll have chaos. You think being nice is going to fix things?" Anthony's stare didn't waver. "I think treating employees with respect builds a business worth working for, and I think customers notice when a store has people who actually care." A murmur spread through the employees. A few exchanged glances, hesitant but hopeful. Derek scoffed, shaking his head. "If you start listening to complaints from the lowest level workers, you'll lose control of your stores. I've been in management for over 15 years. I know what works." "You've been in management for 15 years, and yet this location is the worst performing store in the company," Anthony countered. "Turnover is higher than anywhere else. Customer complaints have doubled. That didn't happen by accident." Derek's mouth opened, but no words came. Anthony exhaled sharply. "I'm done watching this. Effective immediately, you're no longer employed here." The silence that followed was absolute. Derek's face twisted in disbelief. "You're firing me." His voice was louder now, almost incredulous. "You made decisions that directly hurt this store's success," Anthony said. "And I won't tolerate leadership that mistreats employees and alienates customers. You don't belong in this company anymore." Derek's eyes darted around, searching for someone to back him up, but there was no defense to be found. Employees stood quietly, their expressions ranging from stunned to relieved. A bitter chuckle escaped him. "Fine," he spat. "Good luck running this place without me." He tore off his name tag, tossed it onto the counter, and stormed toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open, and he disappeared into the parking lot without another word. The tension in the store didn't immediately lift. Employees remained still, as if waiting for something else to happen. Anthony turned to Ryan, who stood motionless, his hands still gripping the apron he had nearly been forced to surrender. "You're not fired," Anthony said. "In fact, I owe you an apology. You did the right thing, and you shouldn't have had to choose between your job and helping someone." Ryan's grip on the apron loosened slightly. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Anthony scanned the rest of the employees. "I know this store hasn't been an easy place to work. That changes today. I don't expect you to trust that right away, but I'll prove it through actions, not just words." A woman near the front stepped forward hesitantly. She was the cashier Derek had spoken over earlier. "Does that mean things are actually going to change?" "Yes," Anthony said without hesitation. "And I want to hear from all of you about what's been happening here. No more working in an environment where you're afraid to ask questions or speak up. If something's wrong, I want to know about it." Another employee, an older man who had been stocking shelves, let out a deep breath. "It's been bad for a long time," he admitted. "We tried speaking up before, but nothing ever changed." "It will now," Anthony promised. Slowly, the tension began to ease. Employees exchanged glances, some nodding to themselves. The energy in the room shifted not entirely to relief, but to something close. Anthony knew there was still work to be done. One bad manager wouldn't be the end of the store's problems, but it was a start. And this time, he'd make sure no one like Derek ever got the chance to run his stores into the ground again. The employees slowly returned to their tasks, though the atmosphere remained thick with uncertainty. Anthony knew that firing Derek was only the first step. Real change would take more than removing a single toxic manager. The culture of fear and exhaustion wouldn't disappear overnight. He needed to act quickly to ensure the team believed things really would be different. He walked toward the break room, motioning for Ryan and a few other employees to follow. A woman with dark, rimmed glasses and a weary expression hesitated before stepping in. She adjusted her name tag, which read Lisa, and leaned against the counter. Ryan sat at the table, still looking like he wasn't sure if he should actually be there. The older man who had spoken up earlier, identified by his tag as Jim, remained near the door, arms crossed. Anthony leaned against the counter and exhaled. "I'm not here to make empty promises. I need to understand everything that's been happening here. No filters, no holding back." Lisa folded her arms. "You got rid of Derek. That's a start. But managers like him don't just appear out of nowhere. They get away with things because no one in charge is really looking." Anthony absorbed the words. She wasn't wrong. He had relied too much on reports and numbers, assuming they painted the full picture. But numbers didn't capture the exhaustion in Lisa's voice or the way Ryan still looked like he expected another reprimand. Jim sighed. "Most of us stopped speaking up a long time ago. Every time we tried, we got shut down. If it wasn't Derek, it was someone above him backing him up or ignoring the problems entirely." Anthony frowned. "Who above him?" Lisa exchanged glances with Jim before answering. "Regional management. They barely come in, and when they do, they don't spend time talking to us. Derek controlled the narrative. If someone complained, he made sure they weren't around long enough for it to matter." Ryan finally spoke. "It wasn't just the way he treated us. The store itself, it's been falling apart. Shipments are always late, and when they do come, half the inventory is missing. He cut hours for good employees to save money, then blamed us when things didn't get done." Anthony's stomach tightened. He had seen the empty shelves earlier, but had assumed it was just a bad shipment cycle. Now, he realized it was deeper than that. Jim rubbed his forehead. "The worst part? Customers noticed. They started going to other locations. Some of us have been here long enough to remember when this store was busy all the time. Now, half the regulars are gone." Anthony nodded slowly. He had been so focused on expansion, on the bigger picture, that he hadn't seen the cracks forming in the foundation. He had let people like Derek operate unchecked, assuming the systems he had set in place would keep things running smoothly. That assumption had cost him. He straightened. "This ends now. First, I'm bringing in a new manager, someone from outside this store, with no ties to Derek or the way things have been run. Second, I'm restructuring how we handle complaints. No more going through layers of management just to be ignored. If something's wrong, I want to hear about it directly." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "And how do we know you'll actually listen?" Anthony met her gaze. "Because I'm standing here right now, and because I'm not leaving this store until I know things are truly changing." A flicker of something passed over Lisa's face: skepticism, maybe, but also the smallest hint of hope. Ryan leaned forward. "You're really going to stay?" "As long as it takes," Anthony confirmed. Jim studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll hold you to that." Anthony knew they would, and this time he was ready to prove them right. Anthony stayed true to his word. The following morning, he was back at the store before it even opened, standing near the employee entrance as workers arrived. Some hesitated upon seeing him, unsure if his presence meant further upheaval. Others nodded in acknowledgement, though their expressions held cautious skepticism. Inside, the air carried a strange mix of tension and curiosity. The absence of Derek was noticeable, but uncertainty lingered what came next. Anthony wasn't about to let that question go unanswered for long. He gathered everyone in the break room before the first shift began. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as employees settled into the chairs or leaned against the walls. Lisa stood near the back, arms crossed. Ryan sat near the front, his eyes flicking between Anthony and the others. Jim rested a hand on the table, watching attentively. Anthony let a moment pass before speaking. I know yesterday was a shock. Change like this doesn't happen often, and I won't pretend everything is suddenly fixed just because one person is gone. But I meant what I said. I'm staying here until I know this store is running the way it should be. A younger employee near the door shifted his weight. So, what's going to happen now? Are we just waiting for a new manager to show up? Anthony shook his head. No one's being thrown into leadership without the right preparation. I've already started reviewing candidates from other locations, but I want input from you. Whoever steps into that role needs to understand what this team has been through. And until they're in place, I'll be here making sure things don't slip back into old patterns. Lisa exhaled slowly. So you're actually serious about this? Anthony met her gaze. Completely. Ryan leaned forward. What about all the scheduling problems? People keep leaving because they don't get enough hours, and then the rest of us are overworked trying to cover everything. Anthony nodded. I've already asked corporate for a full breakdown of scheduling policies across all locations. If this store's hours were being manipulated to save costs at the expense of the staff, I'll make sure that stops immediately. No more cutting shifts just to make the numbers look better on paper. Jim rubbed his chin. And what about the inventory issues? Half the time, we don't even get what we're supposed to. That's next on my list, Anthony said. I've got a meeting with the regional logistics team later today. I want to know exactly why this store isn't getting the supplies it needs. A few employees exchanged looks. Lisa let out a short breath, shaking her head. All right, she said. I'll admit, I didn't expect you to actually follow through this fast. Anthony gave a small nod. I know words only go so far. That's why I'm not asking for trust, yet I'm going to earn it. The room was quiet for a beat, then Jim pushed back from the table and stood up. Well, if that's the case, I've got shelves to stock. The others followed suit, some more hesitant than others, but the mood had shifted. It wasn't immediate confidence, but it was no longer outright resistance either. Anthony considered that a win. As the employees returned to their stations, Anthony grabbed a clipboard and walked the aisles, scanning the shelves himself. He had already noticed the half-empty sections, but now he took the time to assess exactly which products were missing. Customers were making do with the limited selection, but the gaps were obvious. An older woman browsing the pet supplies aisle frowned at an empty section where bags of dog food should have been. Anthony paused nearby, listening as she muttered under her breath about never finding what she needed here anymore. He approached her and spoke evenly. Excuse me, ma'am. I couldn't help but notice you were looking for something specific. Can I help? She turned, eyeing him cautiously. I come here for the same brand every month, but it's always out of stock lately. I've had to start going to another store just to get it. Anthony glanced at the shelf. That shouldn't be happening. If you don't mind, I'd love to take down the details of what you need and see if I can figure out why we keep missing shipments. The woman looked surprised but nodded. If you can actually fix it, that'd be nice. He jotted down the information and thanked her before heading to the back room. Ryan was already there, unpacking boxes from a new delivery. Anthony stepped beside him, scanning the shipping labels. Have you noticed any patterns with these shortages? Is it always specific brands? Ryan paused, considering. Yeah, it's mostly the higher-selling items, the stuff people ask for the most. We get shipments, but they're always missing key products." Anthony frowned. That was more than just bad luck, it sounded intentional. He made a mental note to push hard in his meeting with logistics. By the time his call with the regional logistics team came around, he had enough details to press for answers. He sat in the store's small office, phone on speaker, as he listened to the explanations. A voice from the other end spoke with forced politeness. "We've been adjusting inventory distribution based on demand." Anthony didn't buy it. Then, why is this store missing its most requested items while other locations are fully stocked? A pause, then a carefully worded response. "To optimize profitability, we allocate inventory based on revenue performance." Anthony's frustration sharpened. "So because this store's numbers dropped under Derek's leadership, you started sending fewer products here, which drove sales down even further. That's not optimization. That's a self-fulfilling failure." Another pause. "We can revisit allocation models if needed." "You'll do more than that," Anthony said. "Effective immediately. I want this store's inventory restored to match customer demand, not past performance." A reluctant agreement followed. Anthony ended the call, leaning back in his chair. It was one problem addressed, but he wasn't done yet. He returned to the floor, spotting Lisa helping a customer near the registers. She glanced at him as he approached. "Any progress?" "I got them to fix the inventory issue," Anthony said. "Shipments should be back to normal starting next week." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "That fast?" Anthony nodded. "When you own the company, red tape tends to disappear." Lisa shook her head, a small, almost amused expression crossing her face. "All right, maybe you really are serious about this." Anthony didn't respond immediately. He simply met her gaze, letting his actions speak for themselves. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time since stepping into this store, he felt like real progress was being made.